Hello, my name is Stacy. Answer this question first. How many times a day do you notice yourself feeling disgust to some other people? Or maybe you have faced this problem yourself when some people just don't like you for no reason. Or, for example, because you're a gay person or you have different nationality. Well, prejudice comes in many forms for our own group or against some other group. Researchers, as we will see, have explored gender, race, and sexual orientation prejudice, but also prejudice involving immigrants, religion, obesity, and age. As for religion, in the aftermath of 11th September and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, Americans with a strong national identity expressed the most disdain for Arab immigrants, and they did so because of their religion, because in their minds, religion was connected to the crimes. Second is obesity. Well, fat isn't fun. One analysis of 2.2 million social media posts containing obese or fat revealed a stream of shaming and flaming, insults, criticism, and derogatory jokes. When seeking love and employment, overweight people, especially white women, face slim prospects. Overweight people marry less often, gain entry to less desirable jobs, and make less money. Third is age. People's perception of the elderly as in general as kind but frail, incompetent, and unproductive predispose patronizing behavior. Baby talk speech, for example, leads elderly people to feel less competent and act less capably. The last thing is immigrants. A fast-growing research literature documents anti-immigrant prejudice among Germans toward Turks, the French toward North Africans, the British toward West Indians and Pakistans, and Americans toward Latin Americans, especially unauthorized immigrants. As we will see, the same factors that feed racial and gender prejudice also feed dislike of immigrants. First of all, let's figure out what prejudice is and what is the difference between stereotype and discrimination. Prejudice is a preconceived negative judgment of a group and its individual members. Prejudice is an attitude. It's a combination of feelings, actions, and beliefs. It can be easily remembered as the ABC of attitudes. A. Affect or feelings, B. Behavior or inclination to act, and C. Cognition or beliefs. A prejudiced person may dislike those different from self and behave in a discriminatory manner, believing them ignorant and dangerous. Stereotype is a belief about the personal attributes of a group of people. Stereotypes are sometimes overgeneralized, inaccurate, and resistant to new information. But sometimes they can be accurate. And what is discrimination? Discrimination is unjustified negative behavior toward a group of people. However, attitudes and behavior are often loosely linked. Prejudiced attitudes do not always breed hostile behavior, nor does all oppression spring from prejudice. Racism and sexism are institutional practices that discriminate even when there is no prejudice. There can be racism without racists and sexism without sexists. For example, consider if word of mouth hiring practices in all white business have effect of excluding potential candidates of different race. Um, this practice can be called racist, even if an employer himself doesn't intend any discrimination. Much discrimination reflects no intended harm. It's simply favoritism toward people like oneself. We can have different explicit or conscious and implicit or automatic attitudes toward the same target. For example, we can think of ourselves as tolerant people who accept any people of any race, any gender, and any sexual orientation. But in fact, we still might have this heritage of prejudice and stereotypes given from our parents and their parents and our culture in general. A raft of experiments uh, converges in pointing to one of the recent social psychologists' big lessons that prejudiced and stereotypic evaluations can occur outside people's awareness. Let's consider racial prejudice. Most people support racial equality and deplore discrimination. Yet, 3 in 4 people who take the implicit association test display an automatic unconscious white preference. Subtle prejudice may also be expressed as microaggressions, such as reluctance to sit on a bus next to a person of another race.
A woman was arrested after a racist rant on a New York bus. 57-year-old Anne-Marie Messiano of Pearl River unleashed an expletive-laden rant at people of color on the public bus and was filmed from multiple angles. Vladimir Philidor, who recorded the video, said that nobody on the bus did anything to provoke her.
And what about gender prejudice? From research on stereotypes, 2 conclusions are indisputable. Strong gender stereotypes exist, and, as often happens, members of a stereotyped group accept them. Men and women agree that you can't judge the book by its sexual cover. Mary Jackman and Mary Center found that gender stereotypes were much stronger than racial stereotypes. Well, stereotypes are beliefs. It is not a behavior, it is not an attitude as prejudice. Stereotypes may support prejudice. Yet, one may believe that without any prejudice, that men and women are different yet equal. Let us therefore see how researchers probe for gender prejudice. Is gender bias fast becoming extinct in Western countries? Has the women's movement nearly completed its work? As with racial prejudice, blatant gender prejudice is dying, but subtle bias lives. In the world beyond democratic Western countries, gender discrimination is not subtle. Women's 20% literacy rate is nearly double men's. And worldwide, some 30% of women have experienced intimate partner violence. Such tendencies are especially likely among men who objectify women by implicitly treating them and viewing them as objects or animals. To conclude, overt prejudice to people of color and against women is far less common today than it was in the mid-20th. Nevertheless, techniques that are sensitive to subtle prejudice still detect widespread bias. And in parts of the world, gender prejudice makes for misery. Another type of prejudice, which is especially spread today, is gay-lesbian prejudice. Most of the world's gay and lesbian people cannot comfortably disclose who they are and whom they love. In many countries, same sex relationships are a criminal offense. But cultures vary. From the mere 6% in Spain who agree that homosexuality is morally unacceptable to 98% in Ghana. In Western countries, anti gay prejudice, though rapidly diminishing, endures. Gay marriage support is mixed but increasing. In Western countries, support for same sex marriage has increased over the last 2 decades. In the United States, for example, from 27% in 1996 to 55% in 2014. There is, however, an enormous generation gap, with 78% of people from 18 to 29 years old and but only 42% of those over age 65. Another problem that gay lesbian people face is harassment. In the National School Climate Survey, 8 out of 10 gay lesbian adolescents reported experiencing sex related harassment in the prior year. Nearly 6 in 10 gay and lesbian American adults report being subject to slurs or jokes, and 3 in 10 report having been threatened or physically attacked. Another point concerning this question is rejection. Rejection happens. In national surveys, 40% of gay and lesbian Americans have said it would be difficult for someone in their community to live openly as gay or lesbian. 39 report having a friend or family member reject them because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So, over time, it gets better. Yet, nearly 9 in 10 LGBT adults in the US still think that discrimination against gays and lesbians is a somewhat a very serious problem. And summing up, what is the nature and power of prejudice? Prejudice is a preconceived negative attitude. Stereotypes are beliefs about another group, beliefs that may be accurate, inaccurate, or overgeneralized, but based on a seed of truth. Discrimination is unjustified negative behavior. Racism and sexism may refer to individuals' prejudicial attitudes or discriminatory behavior or to oppressive institutional practices, even if not intentionally prejudicial. Prejudice exists in subtle and unconscious forms, as well as explicit conscious forms. Researchers have devised subtle survey questions and indirect methods for assessing people's attitudes and behavior to detect unconscious prejudice. Racial prejudice against blacks in the United States was widely accepted until the 1960s. Since that time, it has become far less prevalent, but it still exists. Similarly, prejudice against women and gays and lesbians has lessened in recent decades. Nevertheless, strong gender stereotypes and a fair amount of gender bias are still found in the United States and, to a greater degree, elsewhere around the world. Well, as we can see, prejudice is a social phenomenon. So there must be some social sources of prejudice. So let's talk about them. A principle to remember: unequal status breeds prejudice. Masters view slaves as lazy, lacking ambition, and irresponsible, like as having exactly these traits justify slavery. But after those inequalities exist, prejudice helps justify the economic and social superiority of those who have wealth and power. Sociologist Helen Meyer Hacks noted how stereotypes of blacks and women helped rationalize the inferior status of each. Many people thought both groups were mentally slow, emotional, and primitive. Blacks were inferior, women were weak, blacks were all at their place, and women's place were in the home. To speak easier, um, the inferior status of blacks and women uh, was caused by their traits. That's how superior status rationalize this inequality. We see other groups as competent or as likable, but often not as both. We typically respect the competence of those high in status and like those who agreeably accept a lower status. Depending on the situation, we may seek to impress people with our competence or with warmth. When wanting to appear competent, people will often downplay their warmth, and when wanting to appear warm and likable, people will downplay their competence. Some people, more than others, notice and justify status differences. Those high in social dominance orientation tend to view people in terms of hierarchies. They like their own social group to be high in status. They prefer being on the top. Being in a dominant high status position also tends to promote this orientation. Status breeds prejudice, especially for people high in social dominant orientation. Prejudice springs from unequal status and from other social sources, including our acquired values and attitudes. The influence of family socialization appears in children's prejudices, which often mirror those perceived in their mothers. Even children's implicit racial attitudes reflect their parents' explicit prejudice. Our families and cultures pass on all kinds of information: how to find mates, how to drive cars, divide the household labors, and whom to distrust and dislike. Parental attitudes, assessed shortly after babies are born, predict their children's attitudes 17 years later. Another factor is the authoritarian personality. In those who are strongly prejudiced, prejudice appeared to be not specific to one group, but an entire way of thinking about those who are different. These judgmental, ethnocentric people shared certain tendencies: an intolerance for weakness, a punitive attitude, and a submissive respect for their group's authorities, as reflected in their agreement with such statements as obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. Still today, prejudices coexist. Anti gay, anti immigrant, anti black, anti Muslim, anti women sentiments often live inside the same skin. More recent inquiry into authoritarian people's early lives has revealed that, as children, they often faced harsh discipline. Consider those who benefit from social inequalities. Yeah, the people high in status and high in power, while avowing that all are created equal. They need to justify keeping things the way they are, and what could be a more powerful justification than to believe that God has ordained the existing social order? In almost every country, leaders invoke religion to sanctify the present order. The use of religion to support injustice helps explain a consistent pair of findings concerning North American Christianity. First, white church members have expressed more racial prejudice than non members. And two, the professing fundamentalist beliefs have expressed more prejudice than those professing progressive beliefs. Knowing the correlation between two variables, religion and prejudice, tells us nothing about their causal connection. There may be no causal connection. Perhaps people with less education are both more fundamentalist and more prejudiced. Perhaps prejudice causes religion by leading some people to create religious ideas to support their prejudices. People who feel hated may use religion, even God, to justify their contempt for the other. Perhaps religion causes prejudice, such as by leading people to believe that because all individuals possess free will, impoverished minorities have themselves to blame for their status, and gays and lesbians chose their orientation. If indeed religion causes prejudice, then more religious church members should also be more prejudiced. But three other findings consistently indicate otherwise. Among church members, faithful church attenders were in 24 out of 26 comparisons less prejudiced than occasional attenders. What then is the relationship between religion and racial prejudice? The answer we get depends on how we ask the question. If we define religiousness as church membership or willingness to agree at least superficially with traditional religious beliefs, then the more religious people have been, the more racially prejudiced. Another social source of prejudice can be conformity. Once established, prejudice is maintained largely by inertia. If prejudice is socially accepted, many people will follow the path of less resistance and conform to the fashion. They will act not so much out of need to hate as out of need to be liked and accepted. Thus, people become more likely to favor or oppose discrimination after hearing someone else do so, and they're less supportive of women after hearing sexist humor. Conformity also maintains gender prejudice. If we have come to think that the nursery and the kitchen are the natural sphere of a woman, wrote George Bernard Shaw in an 1898 essay, we have done so exactly as English children come to think that a cage is the natural sphere of a parrot, because they have never seen one else anywhere else. Children who have seen women elsewhere, children of employed women, have expressed less stereotyped views of men and women. In all this, there is a message of hope. If prejudice is not deeply ingrained in personality, then as fashions change and new norms evolve, prejudice can be diminished. And so it has. Social institutions, schools, government, media, families may bolster prejudice through overt policies such as segregation or by passively reinforcing the status quo. Violent rap music from black artists leads both black and white listeners to stereotype blacks as having violent dispositions. Sexual rap music, depictions of promiscuous black females, reduce listeners' support for black pregnant women in need. And frowning and other negative nonverbal behaviors, which are more prevalent toward black than white TV characters, likewise increase viewers' racial bias without their awareness. Summing up, what are the social sources of prejudice? The social situation breeds and maintains prejudice in several ways. A group that enjoys social and economic superiority will often use prejudicial beliefs to justify its privileged position. Children are also brought up in ways that foster or reduce prejudice. The family, religious communities, and the broader society can sustain or reduce prejudices. Social institutions, like government, schools, media, also support prejudice, sometimes through overt policies and sometimes through unintentional inertia. But of course, we cannot blame only social sources. of prejudice. There's something more, like motivational sources of prejudice. Pain and frustration from the blocking of a goal feed hostility. When the cause of our frustration is intimidating or unknown, we often redirect our hostility. This phenomenon of displaced aggression, scapegoating, contributed to the lynchings of African Americans in the South after the Civil War. Between 1882 and 1930, more lynchings occurred in years when cotton prices were low and economic frustration was therefore presumably high. Competition is an important source of frustration that can fuel prejudice. When two groups compete for jobs, housing, or social prestige, one group's goal fulfillment can become the other group's frustration. Thus, the realistic group conflict theory suggests that prejudice arises when groups compete for scarce resources. Feeling superior to others also can cause prejudice. Humans are social species. Our ancestral history prepares us to feed and protect ourselves, to live in groups. Humans cheer for their groups, kill for their groups, die for their groups. Evolution prepares us, when encountering strangers, to make a quick judgment, friend or foe. Those from our group, those who look like us, even those who sound like us with accents like our own, we instantly tend to like. Self concept, our sense of who we are, contains not just a personal identity, our sense of our personal attributes and attitudes, but also a social identity. We categorize. We find it useful to put people, ourselves included, into categories. To label someone as Hindu, a Scot, or a bus driver is a shorthand way of saying some other things about the person. We identify, we associate ourselves with certain groups, our in groups, and gain self esteem by doing so. We also compare, we contrast our groups with other groups, or out groups, with a favorable bias toward our own group. Lacking a positive personal identity, people often seek self esteem by identifying with a group. Thus, many disadvantaged youths find pride, power, security, and identity in gang affiliations. Whoever is dissatisfied with himself is continually ready for revenge. The group definition of who you are, your gender, race, religion, martial status, academic major, implies a definition of who you are not. The circle that includes us, the in group, excludes them, the out group. The mere experience of being formed into groups may promote in group bias. In group bias is one more example of the human quest for a positive self concept. When our group has been successful, we can make ourselves feel better by identifying more strongly with it. College students whose team has just been victorious frequently report, "We won." After their team's defeat, students are more likely to say, "They lost." Actually, in-group bias feeds favoritism. We are so group conscious that, given any excuse to think of ourselves as a group, we will do so, and we will then exhibit in-group bias. In experiments, Tetchwell and Michael Billig further explored how little it takes to provoke favoritism toward us and unfairness toward them. In one study, Tadwell and Billig had individual British teenagers evaluate modern abstract art, and then told them that they and some other favored Paul Klee over art of Vasily Kandinsky. Finally, without ever meeting the other members of their clique favoring groups. Each team divided some money among members of the Klee and Kandinsky favoring groups. In this and other experiments, defining groups, even in this trivial way, produced in-group favoritism. David Wilder summarized the typical result. When given the opportunity to divide 15 points worth money, subjects generally award 9 or 10 points to their own group and 5 or 6 points to the other group. But does it necessarily mean that liking us, liking our group, foster out-group disliking? Does in-group bias reflect liking for one's in-group, dislike for the out-group, or both? Does ethnic pride cause prejudice? Does a strong feminist identity lead feminists to dislike non-feminists? Or do people merely favor their own group without any animosity toward others? Experiments support both liking for the in-group and dislike for the out-group. Yet in-group bias and discrimination result less from out-group hostility than from in-group favoritism. Bias is less a matter of dislike toward those who are different than of networking and mutual support among those in one's group. Even when there is no them, imagine yourself bonding with a handful of fellow survivors on a desert island, one can come to love us. So it seems that positive feelings for our own groups need not be mirrored by equally strong negative feelings for outgroups. Need for status can also breed prejudice. Status is relative. To perceive ourselves as having status, we need someone below us. Thus, one psychological benefit of prejudice or of any status system is a feeling of superiority. In Europe and North America, prejudice is often greater among those low or slipping on the socioeconomic ladder and among those whose positive self-image is threatened. If our status is secure, if we feel authentic pride that's rooted in accomplishment, not just self-aggrandizement, we have less need to feel superior and we express less prejudice. All this suggests that a man who doubts his image and independence might, by proclaiming women to be weak and dependent, boost the masculine image. Experiments confirm the connection between self-image and prejudice. Affirm people, and they will evaluate an outgroup more positively. Threaten their self-image, and they will restore it by denigrating an outgroup. Motivations not only lead people to be prejudiced, but also to avoid prejudice. But try, as we might, to suppress unwanted thoughts, thoughts about food, thoughts about romance with a friend's partner, judgmental thoughts about another group. They sometimes refuse to go away. This is especially so for older adults and people under alcohol's influence who lose some of their ability to inhibit unwanted thoughts and therefore to suppress old stereotypes. Unwanted, dissonant thoughts and feelings often persist. Breaking the prejudice habit is not easy. The motivation to avoid prejudice can lead people to modify their thoughts and actions, aware of the gap between how they should feel and how they do feel. Self-conscious people will feel guilt and try to inhibit their prejudicial response. And, to sum it all up, what is the motivational sources of prejudice? People's motivations affects prejudice. Frustration breeds hostility, which people sometimes vent on scapegoats and sometimes express more directly against competing groups. People also are motivated to view themselves and their groups as superior to other groups. Even trivial group memberships lead people to favor their own group over others. A threat to self image heightens such in group favoritism, as does the need to belong. On a more positive note, if people are motivated to avoid prejudice, they can break the prejudice habit. So, by now, we have talked about social resources of prejudice, about motivational resources of prejudice, and now we're going to talk about cognitive sources of prejudice. Categorization. It's classifying people into groups. It is one way we simplify our environment. We categorize it. We organize the world by clustering objects into groups. A biologist classifies plants and animals, a human classifies people. Having done so, we think about them more easily. If persons in a group share some similarities, like most basketball players are tall, knowing their group memberships can provide useful information about them with minimal effort. Stereotypes represent cognitive efficiency. They're energy saving schemes for making speedy judgments and predicting how others will think and act. We judge people in out groups more quickly. When assessing in group individuals, we take longer to form impressions. When we assign people to groups, athletes, drama majors, math professors, we are likely to exaggerate the similarities within the groups and the differences between them. We assume that other groups are more homogeneous than our own. Mere division into groups can create an out-group homogeneity effect, a sense that they are all alike and different from us and our group. In general, the greater our familiarity with a social group, the more we see its diversity. The less our familiarity, the more we stereotype. Perhaps you have noticed they, the members of any racial group other than your own, even look alike. It is not that we cannot perceive differences among faces of another group. Rather, when looking at a face from another racial group, we often attend first to group. That man is black, rather than to individuals' features. When viewing someone of our own group, we are less attentive to the race category and more attentive to individual details such as the eyes. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you were the only person of your gender, or your race, or nationality? If so, your difference from the others probably made you more noticeable and the object of more attention. Have you noticed that people also define you by most distinctive traits and behaviors? Tell people about someone who is a skydiver and a tennis player, and they will think of the person as a skydiver. As to choose a gift for him, they will pick a skydiving book rather than a tennis book. People also take note of those who violate expectations. Such perceived distinctiveness makes it easier for highly capable job applicants from low status groups to get noticed, although they also must work harder to prove that their abilities are genuine. Distinctive events also foster illusory correlations. Stereotypes assume a correlation between group membership and individuals' presumed characteristics. Italians are emotional. Accountants are perfectionists. Often people's stereotypes are accurate, but sometimes our attentiveness to unusual occurrences creates illusory correlations. Because we are sensitive to distinctive events, The co-occurrence of two such events is especially noticeable, more noticeable than each of the times the unusual events do not occur together. When a self described homosexual person murders or sexually abuses someone, homosexuality is often mentioned. When a heterosexual does the same, the person's sexual orientation is seldom mentioned. Such reporting adds to the illusion of a large correlation between violent tendencies and homosexuality or mental hospitalization. In explaining others' actions, we frequently commit the fundamental attribution error. We attribute others' behavior so much to their inner dispositions that we discount important situational forces. The error occurs partly because our attention focuses on the person, not on the situation. A person's race or sex is vivid and gets attention. The situational forces working upon the person are usually less visible. Slavery was often overlooked as an explanation for slave behavior. The behavior was instead attributed to the slave's own nature. The more people assume that human traits are fixed dispositions, the stronger are their stereotypes and the greater their acceptance of racial inequities. Thomas Pettigrew showed how attribution errors bias people's explanations of group members' behaviors. We grant members of our own group the benefit of the doubt. When explaining acts by members of other groups, we more often assume the worst. Positive behavior by out-group members is more often dismissed. It may be seen as a special case. Disadvantaged groups and groups that stress modesty, such as the Chinese, exhibit less of this group serving bias. Earlier, it was said that blaming the victim can justify the blamer's own superior status. Blaming occurs as people attribute an outgroup's failures to its members' flawed dispositions. If women, blacks, or Jews have been abused, they must somehow have brought it on themselves. From early age, we are taught that good is rewarded and evil punished. Hard work and virtue pay dividends. Laziness and immorality do not. Numerous studies have confirmed this just world phenomenon. Those who assume a just world believe that rape victims must have behaved seductively, or poor people don't deserve better, and sick people are responsible for their illness. So, uh, what are the cognitive sources of prejudice? Recent research shows how the stereotyping that underlies prejudice is a byproduct of our thinking, our ways of simplifying the world. Clustering people into categories exaggerate the uniformity within a group and the differences between groups. A distinctive individual, such as a lone minority person, has a compelling quality that makes us aware of differences that would otherwise go unnoticed. The occurrence of two distinctive events, for example, a minority person committing an unusual crime, helps create an illusory correlation between people and behavior. Attributing others' behavior to their dispositions can lead to the group serving bias, assigning out-group members negative behavior to their natural character, while explaining away their positive behaviors. Blaming the victim results from the common presumption that because this is a just world, people get what they deserve. But is it really so bad? And what are the actual consequences of prejudice? Uh, well, placed in a situation where others expect you to perform poorly because of a stereotype, your anxiety may also cause you to confirm this belief. Claude Steele and his colleagues call this phenomenon stereotype threat, a self confirming apprehension that one will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. So, how does stereotype threat undermine performance? It does so in three ways. First, stress. Second, self monitoring. And three is suppressing unwanted thoughts. Well, yes, prejudice and stereotypes have important consequences, especially when strongly held. when judging unknown individuals and when deciding policies regarding whole groups. Once formed, stereotypes tend to perpetuate themselves and resist change. Prejudice can also undermine people's performance through stereotype threat by making people apprehensive that others will view them stereotypically. Uh, but can we reduce prejudice? Social psychologists have been more successful in explaining prejudice. Nevertheless, we can now anticipate techniques for reducing prejudice. First, if unequal status breeds prejudice, we can seek to create cooperative, equal status relationships. If prejudice rationalizes discriminatory behavior, we can mandate non discrimination. If social institutions support prejudice, we can pull out those supports. If outgroups seem more homogeneous than they really are, we can make efforts to personalize the members. If our automatic prejudices lead us to feel guilt, we can use that guilt to motivate ourselves to break the prejudice habit. So please don't forget that the world today is so diverse that you need to let go of all your prejudices to create a better future. Thank you.